learners, and welcome to part 2 of block 3 unit 4 from the course BSW044. We were talking about the impact of scientific culture and globalization among the tribals. Now before I continue, let's have a small recap of what we did. In the previous session, we discussed about ethnobotany and then moved on to folk medicine. We even looked at the economic and cultural situations of the tribals today. We highlighted the role of the British in regards to the tribals and how religion subjugated the tribals. We also touched upon the mainstream ignorance of the tribals, and so now let us continue and understand more in terms of what we were learning. We talked about religious subjugation, we talked about subjugation by the Britishers. Now let us understand the fragmentation by race, religion and language. Now what happened is that the absence of neat classifications of Adivasis as a homogeneous social cultural category and the intensely fluid nature of non-Adivasis are evident in the insuperable difficulty in arriving at a clear anthropological definition of a tribal in India, be it in terms of ethnicity, race, language, social forms or modes of livelihood. The major wave of entry into India divided the tribal community into Vedics, similar to the Australian Aborigines, and the Paleo-Mongoloid Austro-Asiatic from the northeast. The third were the Greco-Indians who spread across Gujarat, Rajasthan and Pakistan from Central Asia. The fourth is the Negrito group of the Andaman Islands, that is the Great Andamanis, the Onges, the Jarawa and the Sentinelese, who flourish in these parts for some 20,000 years but who could well become extinct soon. The Great Andamanis have been wiped out as a viable community with about only 30% alive, as are the Onges, who are less than 100 in the mid-Indian region. The Gond, who number over 5 million, are the descendants of the dark-skinned Kalorian of Dravidian tribes and speak dialects of Austric language family, and as are the Santal, who number at around 4 million. The Negrito and Australoid people belong to the Mundari family of Munda, Santal, Ho, Ashur, Kharia, Pania, Swara, etc. Now the Dravidian groups include the Gonds, Oraon, Khond, Malto, Bhil, Meena, Garasia, Pradhan, etc. and speak Austric or Dravidian family of languages. The Gujar and Bakarwal descend from the Greco-Indians and are interrelated with the Gujar of Gujarat, and the tribes settle around Gujranwala in Pakistan. Now there are about 200 indigenous people in the northeast. The Boro, Khasi, Jaintia, Naga, Garo and Tripuri belong to the Mongoloid stock like the Naga, Mikir, Apatani, Khasi, Kuki, Karbi, etc. and speak languages of the Tibeto-Burman language group and the Mon Krem. The Adi, Aka, Dafla, Galong, etc. Of Arunachal Pradesh and especially the Garo of Meghalaya are of Tibeto-Burman stock, while the Khasi of Meghalaya belong to the Mon Krem group. In the southern region, the Malayali, Irula, Paniya, Adia, Sholaga, Karumba, etc. belong to the Proto-Australoid racial stock speaking dialects of the Dravidian family. Now the census of India in 1991 had recorded 63 different denominations as other of over 5.7 million people, of which most are Adivasi religions. Though the constitution recognizes them as a distinct cultural group, yet when it comes to religion, those who are not identified as Christians, Muslim or Buddhists are compelled to register themselves as Hindus. Hindus and Christians have interacted with Adivasis to civilize them, which has been defined as Sanskritization and Westernization. However, as reflected during the 1981 census, it is significant that about 5% of the Adivasis registered their religion by the names of their respective tribes or the names adopted by them. In 1991, the corresponding figure rose to about 10% indicating the rising consciousness and assertion of identity. Though Article 350A of the Constitution requires primary education to be imparted in mother tongue, well, now with the new education policy, everything has changed. So, in general, this has not been imparted except in areas where the Adivasis have been assertive. NCERT, the state-owned Premier Education Research Center, has not shown any interest. But now, with the new Education Policy 2020, the government has maintained and taken a keen interest in providing education in the mother tongue till class 5 and preferably till class 8, and which is definitely a welcome respite. Now, with the neglect of Adivasi languages, then, the state and the dominant social order aspire to culturally and socially emasculate the Adivasis subdued by the dominant cultures. The Anthropological Survey of India reported a loss of more than 2/3 of the spoken languages, most of them tribal. Some of the scheduled tribe people of Himachal Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, etc. have their counterparts across the border in China, Bhutan, Myanmar and Bangladesh. The political aspirations of these trans-border tribes who find themselves living in different countries as a result of artificial demarcation of boundaries by erstwhile colonial rulers continue to be ignored despite the spread and proliferation of militancy, especially in the northeast, making it into a conflict zone. The Adivasi territories have been divided amongst the states formed on the basis of primarily the languages of the mainstream caste society, ignoring the validity of applying the same principle of language for the Adivasis in the formation of states. Now, Jharkhand has been divided amongst Bihar, West Bengal, Madhya Pradesh and Orissa, though the Bihar part of Jharkhand has now become a separate state after decades of struggle. Now, the Gond region has been divided amongst Orissa, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh. Similarly, the Bhil region has been divided amongst Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat and Rajasthan. Now, when we talk about all this aspect, definitely the Adivasis or the tribals have to feel a sense of alienation. Now, alienation of Adivasis territory, what do we understand by that? Today, land alienation and marginalization of tribals is the main problem of Adivasis. The total forest cover in India is reported to be approximately more than 700,000 square kilometers, of which 71% are Adivasi area. Of these, more than 400 and more than 200,000 square kilometers are categorized as reserved and protected forests respectively. Around 23% of these are further declared as wildlife sanctuaries and national parks, which alone has displaced some 500,000 or 500,000 of the Adivasis. Now, by the process of colonization of the forest that began formally with the Forest Act of 1864 and finally the Indian Forest Act of 1927, the rights of Adivasis were reduced to mere privileges conferred by the state. Now, after all this aspect, let us understand the tribal dependency on land. This was in acknowledgement of the tribal dependence on the forest for survival and was politically forced upon the rurals by the glorious struggles that the Adivasis waged persistently against the British. The Forest Policy of 1952, the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 and the Forest Conservation Act of 1980 downgraded the privileges of the people to concessions of the state in the post-colonial period. Now, with globalization, there are now further attempts to change these paternalistic concessions to being excluded, as indicated by the draft Conservation of Forests and Natural Ecosystems Act. That is to replace the Forest Act and the amendments proposed to the Land Acquisition Act and Schedule 5 of the Constitution. In 1991, 23% of scheduled tribes were literate as against 42.83% of the general population. The government's 8th planned document mentions that nearly 52% of scheduled tribes live below the poverty line as against 30% of the general population. In a study on Kerala, a state considered to be unique for having developed a more egalitarian society with a high quality of life index comparable to that of only the developed countries, paradoxically shows that for scheduled tribes, the below poverty line population was approximately around 64%, while for the scheduled caste it was 47% and for others it was 41%. About 95% of Adivasis live in rural areas. Less than 10% are hunter-gatherers, but more than half depend upon forest produce. Very commonly, police, forest guards and officials bully and intimidate Adivasis, and large numbers are routinely arrested and jailed, often for petty offences. Only a few Adivasi communities, which are forest dwellers, have not been displaced and continue to live in forests away from the mainstream development activities, such as in parts of Bastar in Madhya Pradesh, Koraput, Fulbani and Mayurbhanj in Orissa and of Andaman Islands. It is tragic that thousands of Korku children below the age of 6 die in the 1990s due to malnutrition and starvation in the Malghat Tiger Reserve of Maharashtra due to the denial of access to their life-sustaining resource base. Adivasis of Kalahandi, Bolangir in Orissa and Palamu in South Bihar have reported severe food shortage. According to the Central Planning Committee of the Government of India, nearly 41 districts with significant Adivasi populations are prone to deaths due to starvation, which are not normally reported as such. Why the Adivasis are having so many troubles? Because of the invasion of Adivasis territories. Now, why is it happening? The Land Acquisition Act of 1894 concretized the supremacy of the sovereign to allow for total colonization of any territory in the name of public interests, which in most cases are not community notions of common good. This is so especially for the Adivasis. Now, the colonial juristic concept of res nullius, that is, which has not been conferred by the sovereign, belongs to the sovereign, and terra nullius, that is, land that belongs to none, bulldoze traditional political and social entities, beginning the wanton destruction of traditional forms of self-governance. The invasion of Adivasi territories, which for the most part commenced during the colonial period, intensified in the post-colonial period. Now, most of the Adivasi territories were claimed by the state. Over 10 million Adivasis have been displaced to make way for development projects such as dams, mining, industries, roads, protected areas, etc. Though most of the dams, around there's so many, more than 3,000, are located in Adivasi areas, only 19.9% in the year 1980 to 81 of Adivasi land holdings are irrigated as compared to 45.9% of all holdings of the general population. India produces as many as 52 principal, 3 fuel, 11 metallic, 38 non-metallic and a number of minor minerals. Of these, 45 major minerals, for example, let's say coal, iron ore, manganese, graphite, limestone are found in Adivasi areas, contributing some 56% of the national total mineral earnings in terms of value. Now, most of these are in the Adivasis areas. Now, income to the government from forests rose from rupees 5.6 million in the year 1869 to 70 to more than rupees 13 billions in the 1970s. The bulk of the nation's productive wealth lay in the Adivasi territories alone. Yet, the Adivasis have been driven out, marginalized and robbed of dignity by the very process of national development. Now, the systematic opening up of Adivasi territories, the development projects and the tribal development projects make them conducive for waves of immigrants. In the rich mineral belt of Jharkhand, the Adivasi population has dropped from around 60% in the year 1911 to as low as 27.67% in the year 1991. These developments have in turn driven out vast numbers of Adivasi to eke out a living in the urban areas and in far-flung places in slums, and that is why we talk about migration among the tribals in today's context. Now, according to a rough estimate, there are more than 40,000 tribal domestic working in Delhi, and most of them women alone. Now, in some places, development-induced migration of Adivasis to other Adivasi areas has also led to fierce conflicts between the tribals, for example, between the Santhali and the Bodo in Assam as well. Now, is there a hope? Is there a hope for tomorrow when we're talking about so many problems? We've discussed so many conspiracy theories as well and so many problems that is emerging. Well, I guess there's hope for tomorrow. The struggle for the future, the conceptual vocabulary used to understand the place of Adivasi in the modern world has been constructed on the feudal, colonial and imperialistic notions which combines traditional and historical constructs with the modern construct based on notion of lineal scientific and technological progress. Historically, the Adivasis unfortunately are at best perceived as subhumans to be kept in isolation, or as primitives living in remote and backward regions who should be civilized. Now, none of them have a rational basis. Consequently, the official and popular perception of Adivasi is merely that of isolation in forests, tribal dialect, animism, primitive occupation, carnivorous diet, naked or semi-naked behavior, nomadic habits, etc. etc. Now, contrast this with the self-perception of Adivasis as casteless, classless and egalitarian in nature, community-based economic systems, symbiotic with nature, democratic according to the demands of the times, accommodative history and people-oriented art and literature. Now, the significance of their sustainable subsistence economy in the midst of a profit-oriented economy is not recognized in the political discourse, and the negative stereotyping of the sustainable subsistence economy of Adivasi societies is based on the wrong premise that the production of surplus is more progressive than the process of social reproduction in coexistence with nature. Now, the writer Bijoy concludes the article by asserting that for the Adivasis, with globalization, the hitherto expropriation of rights as an outcome of development has developed into expropriation of rights as a precondition for development. But some of the hopeful signs emerging from contemporary globalized and scientific culture are the English education. The role of English education, popularized by Lord Macaulay between the year 1800 to 1859, has significantly contributed to the education of Indians in general and tribals in particular. English education was introduced by the British with the twin purpose of impressing upon the natives the value of Western thought and of preparing them for taking up jobs to assist in the administration of the country. Today's Indian economy and culture is significantly influenced by the English, and it is hoped that English will further contribute to the development of tribal, since it acts as a means of getting out of the subjugation, both cultural and economic. Now, let us understand the scientific temper. Our worldview and culture promote scientific spirit and temper. The basic tenets of scientific culture are as follows. The world is understandable. Scientific ideas are subject to change. Scientific knowledge is durable and incomplete. Science demands evidence. Science is a blend of logic and imagination. Science is not authoritarian. Science is a complex social activity generally accepting ethical principle. Coming to the tribal situation, we can hope that scientific culture and temper enables one to respond and respect to humans as humans, irrespective of their origin and culture. In this sense, scientific temper has led to humanistic ideals, which does not allow any human being to be exploited on account of their status. With this, let me sum up the class. In this session, we saw the impact of earlier domination and current globalization on the culture and economy of tribals. We also saw some of the hopeful signs that emerged out of globalization and scientific culture of today. I hope you had a good learning experience, and leaving all the debates aside, it's time for us to think about what we can do for the tribals. Thank you.